It was the early morning of April 20th, 1992. The day had come. Robert Alton Harris lay awake in his cell at San Quentin State Prison, his body cold from the early morning breeze.
The early morning breeze from the open window had cooled off the sheets. It wasn't enough to have nightmares. I had to freeze to death, too. I closed my eyes, but I couldn't close my mind, counting down the few hours I have left.
14 years ago, Harris abducted two teenage boys, John Majewski and Michael Baker, executing them in cold blood before finishing their half-eaten burgers. He needed their car for a bank robbery. Hours later, he was caught. The heavy steel door creaked open. Guards entered his cell for the pre-execution search, a strict final sweep designed to eliminate anything that could interfere with the process. The toilet was inspected, the walls and bars tapped for hidden compartments. His pillow and mattress were removed and x-rayed in the adjustment center, a final precaution against anything unseen. Weapons, substances, or writing materials. Nothing was found. Harris remained quiet. He knew there was nothing to find. Breakfast came like it did every other morning. Routine, unremarkable. Scrambled eggs, toast, coffee. Harris barely touched it. Outside his cell, San Quentin moved differently. Guards exchanged glances, their footsteps a little heavier, their voices quieter. Executions weren't routine anymore. California hadn't killed a man in 25 years. San Quentin went on full lockdown.
Now, as for what is going on inside San Quentin, behind the prison walls of San Quentin right now, there is a general lockdown going on.
All 5,500 inmates were confined to their cells. No work assignments, no yard time, no movement. Executions weren't just about one man. They affected the entire prison. Lockdowns ensured control, prevented chaos, and kept tension from turning into trouble. Today was no different. With security cleared, Harris's final visit began.
Inmate Harris is presently visiting with family and friends, and his visiting will continue until 6 p.m.
Family, friends, and his attorney gathered in the prison visiting room. His cousin, Leon Harris, hugged him once. The guards didn't allow much touching, he recalled, but they let us have that. His brother, Randall, pulled him in. "I love you, Robbie." His friend, Michael Kroll, pressed his cheek to Harris's, but even that brief contact caught the guards' attention. And then there was Michael Lawrence, the attorney still fighting to stop the execution. He had spent the morning filing appeals, desperate to buy more time, but time was running out. At 6 p.m., visitation ended, and moments later, Harris was escorted to the holding area where he was strip-searched, one final security measure. 10 minutes later, he was placed in the holding cell, just 15 paces from the gas chamber. The warden checked in on him. "Robert, how's everything going? Everything okay?" "Yes, Warden. Everything is fine." "Have you been talking to your attorney?" "Yes, I am." "Any problems?" "No, there are not." Then Harris looked at him and asked, "How are you doing, Warden?" At some point, he added, "Warden, when I get where I'm going, I'm putting in a good word for you." The warden later recalled thinking to himself, "I don't know where he's going after this, if he goes anywhere at all, but if he did, I'd hope he'd leave me out of it. I don't want him putting in any words with the devil." Harris didn't beg for mercy or curse his executioners. Instead, he offered them comfort. Harris was no longer alone. His spiritual advisor and nephew, Leon Harris, stepped into the holding cell.
His spiritual advisor he has selected is Reverend Harris. Reverend Harris was brought in and locked in the adjacent death watch cell next to Robert Alton Harris at 6:39 p.m.
Leon Harris, a Baptist minister from Mobile, Alabama, was the one Robert had chosen to stand by him in his final moments. He read from the Bible, and together they prayed. Harris's final meal was brought into the holding cell. A bucket of KFC, 2 pizzas, a 6-pack of Pepsi, a pack of jelly beans, and 2 packs of Camel cigarettes. He shared it with Leon Harris, who later recalled, "There was no bunk in there, just a mattress on the floor. He rolled it up to make a seat out of it, but he didn't sit much. He paced the floor a lot, walking back and forth. The waiting was getting to him."
Good evening. I'm Elaine Corral.
And I'm Dennis Richmond. Robert Alton Harris is at this moment in a death cell watch a few feet away from San Quentin's gas chamber. But less than 2 hours before his scheduled 12:01 execution time, it's still not certain if California will carry out its first execution in a quarter century.
2 hours before the scheduled execution, nothing was certain. Harris's legal team and the ACLU kept filing last-minute appeals, one after another, each requiring a response. As one witness later recalled, it went on all night long. The fate of Robert Alton Harris hung in the balance. The execution team arrived. No more delays, no more appeals. This was it. At least that's what they thought. Fate, or the courts, weren't done with him yet. A phone rang. Harris's attorney had news. "I've got good news and bad news," he said. "The good news, you've got to stay. The bad news, it's only 4 hours." Just before midnight, the courts intervened again, stalling the execution. Judges debated whether cyanide gas was just a method of death or a form of torture. The hour was late, but there was no sleep left to find. The warden arrived at the death cell, flanked by 2 prison officials. There wasn't much to say, just a brief exchange between a man about to die and the one overseeing it. 5 minutes later, the process began. At the warden's verbal signal, the lieutenant in charge of the gas chamber stepped forward and unlocked the cell. "Remove all your clothing," he instructed. Even his socks had to go. A guard entered, handing Harris a new pair of blue jeans and a blue shirt. That was all he was allowed to wear. He was ready for the chamber. The final audience took their places. A group of 57 people, family and friends of both Harris and his victims, state witnesses, and journalists, were led into the witness chamber, where they stood in a semicircle around the gas chamber. Harris's friend, Michael Kroll, later described it as half modern law, half medieval contraption. "These things aren't new stainless steel. This was an old machine, operating unchanged since 1941. The execution team entered with Harris in tow. He walked in calmly, almost unnervingly so, every hair in place, neatly dressed. He chatted with the guards, exchanged lighthearted banter, even smiled at people. But to the victims' families, it was something else entirely. A smirk played on his lips, a swagger in his step. One witness saw a man showing off, another, just a criminal who had never shown remorse. The team led him to a metal chair marked A. There were 2 identical chairs inside, perforated and bolted to the floor, built for the rare occasions when California executed 2 men at once. 2 officers strapped him down while a third checked each buckle. Harris didn't resist. With his back to the witness room, he strained his neck, scanning for familiar faces. And then he waited. At the warden's verbal signal, the process began.
Live back at San Quentin, the gas has been released into the gas chamber. The gas has been released into the gas chamber of Robert Alton Harris.
Harris glanced down. Any second now, the gas would rise, but it wasn't immediate. Minutes passed. Too many. He shifted, looking around. His eyes darted to the floor vents, the place where the gas was supposed to come from, but he felt nothing. The witnesses grew restless. It was taking too long. In the press section, journalists glanced at the clock, whispering. Someone muttered, "How long has it been?" Then a sound. A phone. 2 loud, jarring rings. The room froze. Then, from the witness section, a sudden cry. "Oh my God, no!" A 4th stay.
Oh my, we're getting an incredible word right now. It is not an execution. There is another stay.
The warden made the call. Harris wouldn't be moved back to death row. He would remain in the holding cell. The fight over his fate wasn't over. Efforts were still underway to push the execution forward. His cousin and spiritual advisor, Leon Harris, was there, watching the exhaustion take over. Robert sat slumped on the rolled-up mattress, his head down, barely speaking. The weight of everything pressed on him. Then the cold set in. A guard reached a blanket through the bars. Harris pulled it over his shoulders, but barely moved. Leon couldn't shake the image. Harris, wrapped in the blanket, head down, silent. And so, he waited. In front of the cameras, California Attorney General Dan Lundgren made his stance clear.
There is no good reason for this abusive delay, which has been compounded by last-minute attempts to manipulate the judicial system.
The fight over Harris's fate had reached the highest court in the nation. After the final delay, the U.S. Supreme Court made an unprecedented decision. No further stays would be granted. The execution would go forward. At 6 a.m., prison spokesman Vernell Crittenden spoke to the warden. "We're all in place." Outside, the first light of morning stretched over San Francisco Bay. Inside, Harris was led back to the gas chamber. The heavy, submarine-like door sealed shut behind him at 6:05 a.m. Then, for the first time, he showed remorse. Harris turning toward the victim's family in the soundproof chamber as he mouthed 2 words: "I'm sorry." Then, without warning, the lever was pulled. The gas began to rise. Dan Moraine, a reporter for the Los Angeles Times, captured the haunting scene the next day. His body remained motionless, head bowed. The first sign of death's approach was a twitch in his hands, as though the gas had stung his skin. He inhaled and exhaled 4, maybe 5 times. His head snapped back, his eyes rolled, vacant. 30 seconds later, his head dropped, his body straining against the straps. Then, with unnatural force, his head jerked back up before falling forward again, slowly, like the weight of death pulling him down. At 6:21 a.m., Warden Daniel Vasquez declared inmate B66883 dead. In a press conference, he read Harris's final words aloud.
"You can be a king or a street sweeper, but everybody dances with the Grim Reaper."
Should a monster like Harris have had so many last-minute appeals, or was every delay just an abuse of the courts? Let me know in the comments below. And if you want more deep dives into the darkest true crime cases, hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because this story isn't the last.